following is an AZPM original production.
Welcome to this latest edition of the Press Room from the radio studios of AZPM. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. Coming up, we'll discuss President Trump delaying tariffs on Mexico again and some protests at Tesla in Tucson. Our panelists today are Caitlin Schmidt of the Tucson Spotlight, Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel, Paola Rodriguez of AZPM, Tim Steller of the Arizona Daily Star. Guys, thanks all of you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Caitlin, it's really early in the program. I apologize, but I have to ask you about Sheriff Nanos. And to set a little bit of context for this, Governor Hobbs introduced Operation Desert Guardian as a way to increase border security, and a lot of people would say, not upset President Trump a whole lot. Sheriff Nanos has already pulled himself out of it. It's not a surprise based on some of the things he said about federal policy, but a Democratic sheriff, a Democratic governor, how does this all look?
I mean, yeah, it looks like there's some discord there, definitely. And he's not the only sheriff to have withdrawn from it. The Santa Cruz County sheriff did as well after the conference call about the program. This tracks with what Sheriff Nanos has been telling us, that they don't have the staffing for this, that he's not interested in doing border security. But it sounds like they both were also a little miffed that they were not approached by the governor's office to provide input before she laid out the plan for them.
And I think both of these sheriffs were in campaign ads with Governor Hobbs?
That's right.
Yeah, okay. Paul, what do you make of this? Obviously it's not a stunner, but the politics, though.
Well, of course, there's the politics to it. Nanos has really said he does not want to be involved in border stuff. And this really kind of happens during the Trump administration. The last time we went around to the Trump administration, this was the end of Operation Stone Garden, which was a federal grant that put money into the county and was used to send deputies out in the border regions, especially out towards Ajo. And that program ended because there was so much public outcry against it that the supervisors decided that they got rid of it. Now, one thing to keep in mind about these border things is that this actually costs the county money. Especially when you're paying officers or deputies to be out in a field, they sometimes get time and a half. And then one of the things about like the Operation Stone Garden is that they were deputies who were going out to Ajo and were doing their kind of last few years out there, which is a great way to buttress their salaries, which of course really dramatically increase their pensions. And so for the county, this is expensive. Nanos has said this because he just doesn't have the deputies. He doesn't have the deputies to send out, and he really sees that the Tucson Sector Border Patrol has 3,000 people at least, and that those are the ones who can do border stuff.
Yeah, Paola, it seems like a practical decision, and at the same time, again, I keep pressing the politics. The headlines of this are really interesting. As Sheriff Nanos is, we've talked about some of the controversies before. What do you make of this?
They come from the same party, but I think at the end of the day, Sheriff Nanos has always stood on this idea that, border security is a federal issue, and so federal dollars should be used for a federal issue. We're seeing this kind of narrative in other areas as well. I know last week the Tohono O'odham vice chairwoman was up in Congress saying to the federal government, like, hey, we need more money. We're spending tribal dollars on border security. And so it's not just like a state issue, it's also a tribal issue in that realm, and it's a little bit different with this being a task force put forward by a Democratic governor and, a Democratic sheriff stepping aside. But, he's always maintained the stance of it being a federal issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is consistent, Tim. But the fact is that Nanos is such a larger-than-life personality for Pima County. And I always wonder sometimes if he's trying to generate headlines or if he is just trying to make a practical point.
Oh, well, what I find interesting about it is that he basically fed into this idea when he did the ads. He and Sheriff Hathaway did the border wall walk, the very traditional politician border wall walk with Katie Hobbs. And, they said they were going to, she was good on border security. And then, for him not to do that now, it kind of, to me, looks like a contradiction. But a contradiction from the ad, but not from his general take politically, as these guys have said. His take has been the feds should do it. The other thing I found interesting about it is David Hathaway, and he's made this point repeatedly, said, this task force perpetuates the myth that we are a crime-ridden border community. Mm-hmm. We are not. Most aren't. Most communities on the border are not crime-ridden, and in that sense, don't need this task force.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. The fact is that there is the perception, and obviously this is predicated on the Trump administration and talking about everyone's a thief or a rapist and et cetera, et cetera. So that's an interesting point by Nanos.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it does perpetuate this narrative that we as journalists here work really hard to contradict and dispel, because that's just not the case. I mean, we talk to countless Pauls out there all the time talking to people. It's not a violent, horrible place to be. And by making such a strong statement, by sending federal and state officers to partner up with deputies and hit out in the desert, I mean, it feeds right into that.
Yeah. We're going to get some other stuff related to immigration. But I want to have all of you weigh in a little bit. Again, I'm a political junkie. I apologize in advance. This is one of the things I enjoy talking about. But so Governor Hobbs, she is someone who I wouldn't think people would call her necessarily a traditional progressive, but she's certainly left of center, maybe a traditional Democrat. She was very much against Proposition 314, which obviously passed by 20 points. And if in fact the Texas law goes into effect, Prop 314 will go into effect, and that'll affect immigration policy in Arizona. Does this seem like, I know she's running for re-election, does this seem like dangerous waters, though, for Katie Hobbs to be kind of inconsistent on this issue? I want a border task force, but I was against 314. I'm vetoing most of the things that the legislature sends me. I know she's a politician, but it seems like this could put her in some dangerous waters.
I mean, it's always a problem for someone like Katie Hobbs to run against some of the aspects of the border and also want to do strike force as sort of a border strike force. I mean, in a lot of ways, Katie Hobbs' new administration has gone through and created a lot of the same ideas of Doug Ducey. It's if they're using his playbook. They sent the National Guard to the border to work at the ports. They're doing a new border task force. They're sending money down to all the different law enforcement agencies. I mean, for one thing to keep in mind is like Cochise County, which we kind of sometimes think of as an afterthought, is actually probably has gotten the biggest boon from all these border security things, and even got the most money from Katie Hobbs, who sent millions of dollars specifically to the Cochise County Sheriff to deal with border issues. Now, their border issues, of course, are different than Pima County's. There's been a lot more people driving through Pima County or Cochise County than for Pima County, so the dynamic is really different. But still, like for Katie Hobbs, I think it is a huge risk, because once she falls into the idea that the border is unsecured and that the border is dangerous, it makes much easier for a Republican to come and say, you're not doing enough, we need to secure the border, which is something we hear again and again and again from politicians, even though we spend more money than ever on working on border issues.
Yeah, Paola?
I do want to add to that. I think a lot of what we're seeing too is maybe a reflection of what happened with this past election. I think the Democratic Party is really looking inwardly about how can we refocus some of some of the issues that we're seeing nationwide, and border security was a big issue in this past election. And so I think that might be playing down into state politics about how certain politicians might be looking inwardly about how they should navigate, these contentious issues, and maybe they should be harder on the border.
Yeah, Tim, that's a good point, because obviously Senator Gallego, I think many of us were surprised, not that he tried to go to the center, but the center on this issue as well. And we saw with the Lake and Riley Act, I mean, he kind of enthusiastically voted in favor of that. So I think Paola's point is good, but where does this put Katie Hobbs, though?
Right. It is tacking to the center, and I think that's what we're talking about on border issues, help her in a general election. I think there's risks. She's set out an effort to push herself more toward the center politically, whereas others, and I would mention here the Attorney General Chris Mays, also Senator Mark Kelly, have kind of staked themselves out as opponents to the Trump regime. And Hobbs has acted more conciliatory, or at least willing to work, especially on border issues. I don't know. It's a decision. I don't know whether it's a good decision.
Kayla?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very likely she will not be running unopposed for a second term, and this will probably come back and haunt her, especially if we see her challenged by a Republican. If she's gone soft, said the border's unsecured, like Paul said, that's an easy point to attack her on. But yeah, we didn't see her campaigning a whole lot for the Harris campaign, so she definitely took a back seat there. So I'm not super surprised by a move to the center at this point.
Yeah. So, Paola, no surprise, we're going to talk more about Trump administration policies. Let's talk about this whiplash on tariffs. We're seeing, okay, now I'm going to give breaks to Mexico because the big three automakers in the U.S. asked me to, and now maybe I'll just give them another month or so. And I had this great conversation, because I guess all of his conversations are great, with President Sheinbaum. So what do you make of all the whiplash right now?
I mean, what it's looking like is that, President Trump is wanting to see automakers move more of their productions towards the United States. So that way, come a month when those tariffs start to hit, it's not as bad of a hit. I have heard from reporting from New York Times, NPR, that, 1 month is not enough time to, move all of those productions, because we're talking more than just people, right? We're talking about facilities too. And so, it'll be interesting to see what comes of it in this next month.
Yeah. So, Paul, I think, again, whiplash. I keep saying, we know that President Trump is non-traditional. Is that fair to say at this point?
That's fair to say.
but it just seems strange for someone who, and then he looks at the stock market, goes down really horribly for a couple of days. Okay, well, maybe I'll give the tariffs a little bit of a break. It just seems like this is going to be very difficult for anyone on the ground in Pima County, in Mexico, trying to figure out what are we supposed to do, because the economy is going to affect every single person. So what do you make of what's going on?
Well, one thing, it's going to keep, what it's going to do is it's going to stall investments and relationships in Mexico and in the United States, because no one's going to know what to do. Where should you build your factory right now? Where should you build facilities? Where should you get your workers? If you're Ford Motor Company, there's products from Ford Motor that might cross the border, U.S.-Mexico border, 4 or 5 times before it's finally built in an F-150 that's finished in Mexico. So how do you manipulate, or how do you deal with that situation? And then you see something like in Nogales, there's been a lot of investments toward doing the big produce warehouses. Jamie Chamberlain, he did a big warehouse actually with Juan Ciscomani and Doug Ducey. And that was something that was a huge investment. And the idea is that products from Mexico would come to the United States, be repacked, and that was an investment. So somebody like that, how do you invest if you're not sure if suddenly there's going to be a huge tariff? And that means that products may not be coming in the same way. Everyone stalls that investment. And I think for businesses all throughout Southern Arizona, this is a huge problem, because the uncertainty means they're not going to do it.
Well, yeah, when Paul referenced Doug Ducey, one of the things Doug Ducey would say, even as Donald Trump was criticizing Mexico, is Mexico's Arizona's most important trade partner.
Yep.
So...
yeah, it's difficult. I was talking to people Tuesday, and they were trying to figure out, this is the first day that the 25% tariff was imposed, and there was just, they weren't sure what they were supposed to do that day. There were various fees and stuff they were trying to work out. It has to be paid within a certain number of days. And so that was Tuesday. Then Wednesday came, and we were still under 25% tariffs. And Thursday, there was whispers something was going to change. Well, then he reverts to the USMCA terms of the US. This is the craziest thing.
Which he renegotiated.
Right. So he renegotiated NAFTA as the USMCA, and he is essentially violating its terms by imposing these tariffs. So now he has retreated after having this wonderful conversation that you talked about with President Sheinbaum to the terms of USMCA, and he's saying that we will put tariffs on anything that isn't covered by the USMCA. So, who knows where we're stopping? I can't believe it. And that's just for a month. There's another deadline. It's just this continual uncertainty that he's perpetuating.
Well, Tim, I want to stick with you a little bit, because I want to talk a little bit about your trip to Mexico. So, obviously, some of this is quite anecdotal. There are many, 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 many millions of people in the country, so you can get a chance to talk to them. But what was the vibe you were picking up from the folks you did speak with?
Oh, well, okay. So I was in Sonoyta last week, across from Lukeville, and I was in Nogales. And my colleague Emily was in Sasabe. Honestly, it is a picture of relative calm. I've often thought that the chaos at the border has been exaggerated most of the time, that it takes place episodically in certain places. But right now, it was calmed down before Trump took office, and it's more calmed down now. Now, what I was there for was to look at what the National Guard, the Mexican Guardia Nacional, is doing. The reason is that 10,000 showed up at the Mexican border with the United States as a result of the initial back and forth with Claudia Sheinbaum, about 1,500 on the Sonoran border. And, what I found was a lot of make work, honestly. It's more of a show than anything. They were checking cars coming across the border, very little coming to the U.S. Port of entry, I should say, going northbound, and very little to show for that in terms of seizures or anything, but it's just a presence. They're also there to help deported people and other migrants, and there's big setup in Nogales to help these people, as there is across the border in Mexican cities on an initiative of the president, and they're very lightly used. There's a lot of social service people, ambulance drivers, medics, etc., just sitting around on their phones.
Yeah, and so was this some of this an image to project to our president, President Trump, to show that, hey, we're trying to cooperate. We're doing this.
Yeah, no. So like on the border there, to me, it has mostly been a demonstration, a show of force, emphasis on the show. I should say there has been some reporting from further south. I was getting it from the New York Times that there has been a real crackdown on manufacturing of fentanyl in Sinaloa. It's unclear as yet as to whether there's any impact up here. As far as I know, and I've checked a little bit, the price of fentanyl is more or less the same on the streets of Tucson as it was before. If we start to see that price change, or if we start to see a lack of supply, then we'll know there's actually an effect.
Interesting. Paul, let me ask you about a story you were writing about ICE arrest and removal numbers.
Right.
So I know that President Trump's only been in office for a short amount of time, though so much has been going on. And some of the numbers I think that you have are only maybe the first few weeks he was in office. But what are some of the numbers showing? I mean, are they way down, way up from the Biden administration? What are we seeing with ICE?
Well, one thing that's really tricky is that we're just not seeing the sort of big push of arrests that, despite the president's sort of shock and awe, where he's really wanted to push lots and lots of arrests throughout the United States, that just hasn't happened. And there's probably good constraints for it. There's just not enough ICE officers, even when they use U.S. Marshals and other folks. They can't do it, and they don't have the detention space. Of course, they've made a big show of this. This is something the Trump administration is really good at. Of course, they did the big military flights. They even had a military flight here in Tucson that put about 80 people to Central and flew them to Central America. Those flights, of course, are egregiously expensive, and they already had programs to do that through ICE Air. So it was there to show we were using the military to do those things. But right now, so far the data shows, which is a little bit late because it's data from ICE that then gets compiled and then sent to track these folks who actually keep track of it, and it really shows that arrests are just not what you would expect them to be, and there's just the efforts. In some ways, like the efforts just aren't as good as they were under the Biden administration. The Biden administration was in some ways more effective at arresting people and deporting people than the Trump administration has been. And so we'll see if that holds up, if that situation changes. But right now, that hasn't happened. The other thing that's really important, though, is that the Trump administration has really gone after people who don't really have criminal histories. They're sort of gobbling up people who are maybe, as someone put it, they're low-hanging fruit. They're the easiest people to arrest, and they can make arrests so they can show that they're trying to do well, even though they're getting people who really aren't the sort of super criminals that you would expect from the rhetoric from the Trump administration.
Yeah. And Paola, it seems like a lot of this is intimidation, frankly, just to scare people, many of whom are not necessarily falling under this umbrella the Trump administration wants to label them under.
Yeah, I think going back to what Paul was saying, I think maybe a lot of it is trying to make sure like we're trying to make these steps, and maybe the best way to do that right now for the Trump administration is going for that low-hanging fruit to maybe build confidence within the American public about us, the U.S. securing the border. But, from what it's sounding like within the Tucson area, a lot of families that come from immigrant backgrounds are very intimidated by what's going on.
Caitlin, do you find that as well?
Yes. My colleague Susan was at a home last week with a Venezuelan family who had a scheduled visit from ICE. They had stopped by the day before, said they were there to check up on their children and make sure they weren't being trafficked. The husband was the only one home, so they told them they'd be back the next day at 4 p.m. This family quickly got an attorney. The attorney called a lot of press. There was a big showing out there when ICE arrived, but it made a lot of headlines too. So, giving someone notice that you're going to show up with agents is a pretty good way to make sure that there will be photographers and reporters there too. So I'm not saying they're not genuine efforts, but they certainly are demonstrative in a way.
Another thing that has people upset related to the Trump administration has to do with DOGE. Nearly 1,000 people protested last weekend at Tucson's Tesla dealership, a third week in a row for protests there. Mm-hmm. Other protests took place downtown. Paul, what message is being sent? And also, you got to tell the quick Tesla owner story.
Oh, sure.
A few people out there with Teslas.
Yeah. So I showed up, and there were 1,000 people protesting at River and Oracle over by the Tesla dealership there, and there were 3 people who actually had Tesla cars, and they were part of the protest. So they had signs on their cars. But one thing that was sort of particular is each one of them have a bumper sticker, which essentially said, "We bought this before we realized Elon was crazy," and that's sort of it's a tricky thing because lots of people who own Teslas, of course, are maybe not staunch conservatives. They bought this because they wanted to save the environment. And now they're sort of stuck with this car that really I think a lot of people really starting to really hate. And for the people at the Tesla dealership, I mean, there's sort of this kind of, somebody would walk out and sort of look at the crowd and go, "Oh no," and then walk back in. But this is the third time that people have protested this dealership, and they're really showing their fury at Elon Musk. They're showing their fury at Doge, and at the Trump administration. And one of the things that were interesting is, of course, then I went to Saguaro National Park, and there was another protest about the cuts there. So you see there's people who are actually, I think, really invigorated and angry about the things that are happening. I think the hard question is whether this turns into actually like movement and electoral movement, whether or not they can actually turn this new movement to win elections. But right now, there are lots of people who are very angry and really want to hear their voices heard about the things that they don't like, what's happening in our government.
Yeah, and Kaylin, that's the thing I'm especially curious about is, we've talked about this on the program a lot. You guys have been journalists here for a long time, that this is a left of center community for the most part. So do we have to see, and are we seeing Tesla protests? I don't know if we're seeing Tesla protests across the country in places that may be less traditionally blue, and whether that is some of the impact. And one of the things that came to mind for me is the crowd size. And Paul, thanks for having the number, because we know how much President Trump loves crowd sizes. So he can kind of measure where the impact of these kinds of things. But I don't know, what sort of impact do you think this can have?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see continued protests in Tucson for the foreseeable future. There's one today at the U of A here, Stand for Science. And we had one on Monday for Day Without Immigrants. And we saw those in a lot of cities. This is the second one of those protests, largely in cities in California and Texas that have large immigrant populations. But I think this is just going to grow in steam. I mean, I will be shocked if we don't have another protest at Tesla this weekend, and if it's not a bigger crowd. I mean, as these efforts continue and as people are impacted and as they get upset, I think we're going to see them join forces. And I mean, my Instagram feed this week was full of pictures of people replacing their Tesla logos with other car logos. So, I mean, there seems to be some shame there now.
Yeah. And Tim, what did you see downtown?
Oh, I wasn't downtown. I was at the Tesla one as well.
Sorry, okay,
But yes, there were two protests downtown on Tuesday. One that went to the City Hall and another one at the Federal Building. I'm not sure which. Yeah. So yeah, they're not, we should say, coordinated with each other in most cases. So they're just kind of cropping up here and there. I would say on the Tesla thing, one thing I found interesting is reading more about it and reading about Elon Musk. So the idea is to be, people who are upset with Musk and his role in the administration are trying to demonstrate it at Tesla. It actually, I've learned, can have an impact, because I didn't understand how much of his wealth is tied up in Tesla, and it is a lot. And he also has leveraged that wealth to get loans. And so as a result, when the stock price falls, which it has been steeply lately, at a certain point there are margin calls from his lenders who need either more stock, more commitments. And so that then also has a depressing effect on the share value.
Yeah. All right, let's spend our last few minutes, Kaylin. Let me start with you on Prop 414, which we've been talking about for weeks. A very important election to see if the sales tax is going to be increased. There are folks who say it's regressive, shouldn't be done. There are also folks who say, well, we need this money to pay for police, fire, help the unhoused. It's been a discussion as well, a lot more no signs on corners than yes signs. And I think when the campaign started, maybe that would have surprised people. So what are you hearing right now? What kind of numbers have we seen so far in terms of ballots that have been returned?
Yeah, so Paul's colleague Jim Ninsel reported that 55,000 ballots had been returned, which is about 18%. 305,000 went out. I know my ballot is still sitting at home, so I think that there are a lot of people that intend to vote that just haven't done that yet. So I think we'll see those go up, but that's pretty good turnout for a city election. And I think that this touches on a lot of hot button issues that people really care about. How affordable housing, homelessness, police surveillance, police technology, all of those things. It's hard to find a person that doesn't feel strongly about those issues. So, I mean, I think they have some voter appeal there. There's been a lot of spending. We've seen about $300,000 spent in this race, kind of evenly on both sides, a little more by the no side. But that's a lot of money for an off-year city election.
Have you filled out the ballot yet?
It's one question.
Hey, it's a long ballot. Take your time.
So how are you going to vote? Oh, sorry. Okay. Paola, what are you seeing? I mean, you were out of town for a couple of weeks, but what are you feeling when it comes to?
I'm seeing a lot of people on both sides. I'm perpetually online, and I get notifications on my phone, Reddit threads of people being like, vote no for Prop 414, and people saying vote yes. I think what Caitlin was saying with there being hot button issues like policing and, the housing crisis, a lot of people are put off by the fact that, the police department would possibly get a new helicopter and they don't see a need for that, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe other people are saying that there needs to be more resources put towards housing initiatives. And, depending where you sit on those issues, that might sit well with you, that might not. And so, yeah.
So turnout, Paul and Tim, let me start with you. Turnout is important. As Caitlin said, it's 18% so far. Off your election, just a few months after a massive election where people needed to take a little break from, and yet this is a really important issue being decided. Is this just sort of politics as usual? We want to have turnout low on this?
Yeah, right. So the idea, the common wisdom locally is that if you want, that you try to pick your electorate on these sorts of issues where you can choose when to have the election. So the idea is that if you hold an election in March, then you can motivate the people who take your side. Now, as it turns out, there's just a lot of motivated people on both sides for this issue, and as stated, more energy, I would say, certainly more money on the side of the no, partly because there is opposition on the right and on the left.
Yeah, Paul, just a few seconds left. If it doesn't pass, I'm not going to say, hey, you're a consultant, what's the next step? But what kind of impact could this have if it goes down?
Well, it's going to have a huge impact. One thing to keep in mind is a lot of the things that the city is doing for homeless and homeless sheltering and things, that money's gone. The federal money, of course, is getting cut back. There's probably going to be less state money, so those things are going to go away. And then, of course, like the police. The police want new vehicles. They have lots of aging vehicles that are increasingly unsafe and worn. I don't know how the police department is going to cover that. There's been a lot of talk about the airplane, the surveillance airplane. Of course, the police want. One thing to keep in mind is that's replacing their helicopters, which are aging and old too, and also maybe lets them do some things that people actually want them to do.
On our next edition of the Press Room, we will be discussing the outcome. We hope we'll have the numbers by then. Thanks to a great panel: Caitlin Schmidt of the Tucson Spotlight, Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel, Paola Rodriguez, AZPM, Tim Steller of the Arizona Daily Star. Thank you all. And thank you very much for watching this edition of the Press Room. I'm Steve Goldstein. Enjoy the rest of your night.